Welcome to Disaster Tales. No more sleep today, boss. No more sleep today, boss. Good morning, or good evening to you, boss. This is your brother Disaster. And today, this is your favorite show, or what's about to become your favorite show, on your favorite digital radio station, or the one that's gonna be your favorite real soon. Here, it's Unbound Horror. Whether it's summer or winter, our winter season never ends. Whether you're listening from the US, the UK, or Canada, it doesn't matter, we're all one family here, boss. Whether you're in your 40s, 50s, 60s, or 70s, you and I are brothers and friends. Even if this is your first time listening, your presence here was meant to be. We all share that spirit of adventure, we're all young wherever horror and adventure find us. And one final piece of advice. If true stories and everything that comes with them scare you, step out, this isn't the place for you. Because here, we buckle up for the fear. Before we turn the volume all the way up. This is Disaster on the Radio, boss. Let's roll. Let's begin, boss. The Atlantic storm hammered the black granite cliffs of northern Maine with absolute brutality, driving sheets of wet, heavy snow against the reinforced windshield of my Ford sedan until the glass was completely caked in white slush. I killed the engine, the sudden silence inside the cabin broken only by the ticking of the cooling metal under the hood and the relentless howl of the wind tearing across the open ridge. I reached over, grabbed my heavy leather duffel bag from the passenger seat, and shoved the car door open against the gale, stepping ankle-deep into the freezing, churning mud of the unpaved driveway. The estate loomed directly ahead, a massive, decaying Victorian structure built entirely of dark timber and rough-hewn gray stone, standing like an abandoned fortress against the edge of the drop-off. My younger brother's car had been found abandoned just 3 miles down this exact coastal road 3 months ago, doors unlocked, engine cold, and no trace of him left behind except for a local police report that was hastily closed as an accidental drowning. I didn't believe a single word of it, boss, and I certainly didn't come out here looking for closure or sympathy. I came to pull the thread until the entire rotten sweater unraveled. I hauled my weight up the frozen stone steps, my boots crunching hard on the ice, and pulled a heavy, oxidized bronze key from the inner pocket of my jacket. I jammed it into the keyhole of the massive front door, shoved my shoulder against the thick oak panels, and forced the rusted tumblers to turn with a sharp, echoing metallic snap. The door swung inward, releasing an instantaneous, suffocating wall of trapped air, a dense, nauseating cocktail of dry cedar rot, stale candle tallow, old paper dust, and the unmistakable, lingering reek of damp earth that had been sealed inside for decades. I stepped across the threshold, pulled the door shut behind me with a resounding thud, and threw the heavy iron deadbolt into its frame, locking the outside world completely out of reach. I dropped my duffel bag onto the hardwood floor of the foyer, unzipped my coat, and pulled a compact propane torch from my pocket, clicking the igniter until a sharp, hissing blue flame flared into life to cut through the absolute darkness of the hallway. The foyer was a cavernous tomb of forgotten wealth, flanked on both sides by floor-to-ceiling oil portraits of ancestral figures whose dark, painted eyes seemed to track every movement of my boots across the floorboards. I ignored them, keeping my jaw clenched and my grip tight on the torch as I walked down the long, narrow corridor toward the grand hearth room at the center of the estate. The floorboards groaned beneath my weight with every single step, a dry, protesting shriek that bounced off the high vaulted ceilings and echoed back down the hall. When I reached the hearth room, I dropped to my knees in front of the massive stone fireplace, pulled a stack of dry pine kindling and split logs from the brass rack beside the stone, and piled them loosely inside the brick cavity. I flicked the propane torch, swept the blue flame across the dry bark, and watched as the fire caught instantly, casting long, writhing yellow shadows across the high walls and driving the biting chill back from my skin. I stood up, shaking the wood ash from my fingers, and looked around the vast, silent room. In the far corner, near a tall, arched stained glass window rattling violently against the wind, stood an antique grandfather clock, its heavy brass pendulum swinging back and forth in a slow, hypnotic rhythm that punctuated the quiet with a heavy, mechanical thud. But my eyes were immediately drawn to the center of the room, right to a heavy mahogany table positioned directly in front of the fireplace. Resting squarely in the middle of the polished wood was a single object, a thick, leather-bound journal, its dark cover wrapped tightly and repeatedly with a broad, frayed strip of black fabric, tied off with a knot that looked intentionally permanent. My grandfather had spent the last 30 years of his life locked inside this house, refusing visitors, refusing contact, and filling hundreds of pages with observations that the local authorities were too terrified or too lazy to investigate. I crossed the room, my boots striking the floor with sharp, deliberate cadence, stopped right beside the table, and stared down at the bound journal. The air in the room suddenly grew 10 degrees colder, the fire in the hearth dipping into a low, stuttering blue ember as if something in the room had just inhaled all the oxygen at once. I reached out with my bare hand, hooked my fingers beneath the heavy black cloth, and gave it a hard, vicious yank, tearing the fabric apart with a sharp, echoing snap that signaled the official start of a game I could no longer walk away from, boss. The frayed strip of black fabric hit the polished mahogany table with a dry snap, and I didn't waste a second staring at it, boss. I cracked open the heavy leather cover of the journal, the dried spine groaning under my fingers as thick, yellowed pages fell open to a chaotic wall of frantic, jagged handwriting scrawled in dark, bleeding ink. I swept my flashlight across the page, my eyes tracking the words at a dead sprint, asterisk, the weight doesn't stay in the dirt, Edward. It follows the bloodline through the salt water. I brought it back from the Dublin docks in '72, locked inside a lead-lined crate, but the box rusted through before the winter was half over. Asterisk. Before I could flip to the next page, a heavy, metallic slam echoed from the deep recesses of the back hallway behind the grand staircase. Clang, SKRT. It wasn't the wind. The exterior doors were bolted, and the storm was hitting the front face of the house, yet something back in the service corridors had just shifted with enough force to rattle the wainscoting. I slammed the journal shut, shoved it flat against the wood, and reached inside my jacket, wrapping my fingers around the cold, checkered grip of my Glock 19. I clicked off the safety with my thumb, pulled a heavy tactical flashlight with my left hand, and spun around on my heel, moving out of the hearth room in a low, rapid stride. The main hallway stretched into absolute blackness, broken only by the pale, stuttering beam of my light cutting through floating motes of dust and dry lime. I checked the doors on my left, the formal dining room, its long mahogany table caked in a thick layer of gray soot, the chairs pushed back at odd angles as if the guests had stood up mid-meal and bolted 50 years ago. I cleared the room in 3 rapid steps, sweeping the muzzle from corner to corner, finding nothing except empty china cabinets and shattered window panes where the draft was whistling through the cracks. I backed out into the corridor, my boots hammering hard against the floorboards, and pushed deeper toward the rear service wing where the kitchen and the cellar stairs were hidden behind a heavy swinging door. The air back here tasted foul, sour grease, rotting potatoes, and the unmistakable, metallic tang of stagnant well water. I grabbed the brass handle of the service door, yanked it open with a hard jerk, and swept my light down the steep, stone-lined stairwell leading straight into the dark underbelly of the house. The noise came again, louder this time, right from the bottom of the steps. Thump, scrape, thump. Something heavy was dragging itself across the damp concrete floor of the cellar, moving with a slow, deliberate rhythm that climbed straight up the vertical shaft of the stairwell. I didn't hesitate, boss. I stepped to the edge of the top step, flicked the tactical light to maximum strobe, and aimed the barrel straight down into the pitch-black void, ready to put a round into whatever was crawling up out of the dark. I didn't wait for whatever was at the bottom of those stone stairs to introduce itself, boss. I dropped my right foot onto the first damp tread, keeping the Glock locked straight at eye level, and descended the staircase in a fast, controlled tactical slide, letting the strobe light tear through the blackness ahead of me. The air down here was 20 degrees colder than the main floor, thick with the sharp stench of rotting timber, damp soil, and the unmistakable, metallic tang of stagnant well water. Thump, scrape, thump. The sound stopped the second my boots hit the concrete floor of the basement. I swept the light in a rapid 180-degree arc, painting the sprawling subterranean space in harsh flashes of white. To my left stood rows of rotting wooden wine racks, empty bottles rolling across the floor with hollow, clinking echoes. To my right was a massive brick foundation wall weeping groundwater through hairline cracks. Directly in front of me, cutting across the center of the concrete floor, were a set of fresh, muddy boot prints. They weren't decades old, boss. The mud was still wet, tracking a straight line from the foot of the stairs toward the deep, shadowed storage vaults at the back of the cellar. I didn't call out. You don't announce your position when you're hunting something that knows the floorboards better than you do. I gripped the tactical flashlight tighter in my left hand, tucked my elbows close to my ribs, and followed the mud tracks at a rapid jog, keeping my boots light against the concrete to mask my approach. The tracks led straight into a partitioned stone alcove that my grandfather had apparently used as a private workshop. I hit the alcove threshold, sweeping the barrel of my gun across the space in a split-second split. A heavy oak workbench sat in the center of the room, littered with rusted surgical tools, open glass vials, and scattered medical ledgers with their pages curled from moisture. Next to the bench, lying face down in a puddle of muddy water, was a silver chain necklace with a heavy steel pendant, the exact piece my brother wore around his neck every single day before he vanished. I stepped forward, dropped to one knee, and snatched the necklace out of the mud, checking the clasp. It was snapped clean open, as if it had been ripped off his throat with violent force. Before I could pocket the chain, a heavy, resonant metallic slam echoed from the top of the stairwell behind me. Asterisk clang. The cellar door at the top of the steps had just been slammed shut from the outside. Before I could even spin around, a second sound followed, the heavy iron deadbolt sliding across its metal track with a vicious, final thump. I was locked down in the dark. I didn't hesitate, boss. I surged up from the concrete floor, sprinted across the alcove, and charged back toward the base of the stairwell, taking the stone steps 3 at a time in a blind, aggressive rush. I slammed my shoulder against the heavy wood of the cellar door, but it didn't budge. The deadbolt was seated deep in the reinforced frame. I raised the Glock, pressed the muzzle directly against the thick oak panel 2 inches above the doorknob, and pulled the trigger twice in rapid succession. Asterisk bang. Bang, asterisk. The muzzle flash lit the stairwell in a blinding orange glare, the deafening concussive blast hammering my eardrums in the confined space as splinters of dry wood exploded inward. I kicked out with the heel of my boot, driving my soul straight into the shattered latch, and the door burst open, crashing against the hallway wall as I scrambled out into the dark service corridor, gun raised and ready for whatever was waiting for me in the shadows, boss. I didn't waste a single heartbeat standing in that smoke-choked service corridor, boss. I shoved off the wall with my left boot, swept the Glock 19 back into a high-ready position, and bolted back toward the main foyer with my lungs burning from the sulfur and rot of the cellar. The house around me seemed to shift, the ancient timbers groaning under the weight of the storm outside as if the entire structure was settling lower into the coastal mud. I hit the base of the grand staircase without slowing down, taking the steps in aggressive, 2-at-a-time bounds that hammered the hollow wood with the sound of a drum roll. My right hand kept a death grip on the tactical flashlight, its harsh white beam cutting straight through the floating dust motes and illuminating the peeling wallpaper of the second-floor landing. The air up here was thin, dead, and biting cold, carrying none of the warmth from the hearth downstairs. I cleared the landing, pivoting sharply to the left into the narrow, unlit west wing corridor, the dead zone that didn't appear on any of the original architectural blueprints I'd pulled from county records back in Boston. The baseboards here were warped from decades of unmitigated dampness, and the floorboards dipped dangerously in the center, creating a spongy underfoot sensation that forced me to shorten my stride and stay on the balls of my feet. Every breath I took rattled in my chest, tasting faintly of copper and frozen dust. At the very end of the dead-end hallway stood the door. It wasn't a standard interior door. It was a thick slab of solid oak reinforced with vertical bands of blackened iron, bolted directly into the load-bearing stone partition wall with heavy hexagonal lag screws. Across the center sat a heavy iron crossbar, locked in place by a massive, unpolished brass padlock the size of a clenched fist. And it was making noise. Thud, scrape, thud. The sound wasn't coming from behind the wood anymore, it was vibrating right through the iron bands, a steady, rhythmic impact that felt like a fist driving itself against the grain over and over again with mechanical precision. I didn't bother trying the knob. I swept my eyes across the frame, holstered the Glock back into my waistband, and reached down, ripping a heavy iron fire poker out of the brass stand next to the hallway radiator. The cold iron bit hard into my raw palm, still stinging from the damp chill, but I ignored the pain, hooked the curved end of the poker straight into the rusted shackle of the brass padlock, and planted my left boot firmly against the base of the doorframe. I threw my entire body weight backward, using the 4-foot iron rod as a mechanical lever, putting every ounce of torque into the joint. Creak, snap. The sound of aged iron twisting under stress echoed down the narrow corridor like a pistol shot. The rusted mounting screws holding the iron staple to the doorframe didn't just pull out, they tore clean through 2 inches of rotten timber, showering the floor with a cloud of dry, gray wood splinters and powdered drywall. The heavy iron crossbar dropped with a deafening crash, hitting the floorboards and bouncing hard against my shins, sending a dull ache shooting up my leg. I didn't wait for the echoes to die down. I kicked the door open with the heel of my boot, ripping the heavy oak panels inward against the dark, and stepped back into a low combat stance with the Glock gripped firmly in both hands, sweeping the barrel across the pitch-black threshold as an absolute wall of freezing, putrid air rushed out to meet me, boss. The air that surged out of that busted-open doorway didn't just smell cold, boss. It hit the back of my throat with the sharp, acidic tang of burnt electrical insulation and wet rust. I didn't give it a single second to settle or drift. I stepped right across the splintered wood of the threshold, slamming my lead boot flat against the floorboards while keeping the Glock 19 locked straight at eye level, my index finger resting safely along the slide until targets were acquired. My tactical flashlight cut a harsh, blinding white tunnel through the blackness, slicing across rows of towering, industrial-grade steel filing cabinets that lined the walls from floor to ceiling, turning the hidden room into a claustrophobic labyrinth of gray metal and dead space. This wasn't a residential bedroom or a guest suite, it was a secure, windowless records vault hidden deep inside the unmapped dead space of the mansion's west wing. Tap, tap, scuff. The sound didn't come from behind the door anymore. It was live, moving fast across the bare wood toward the far dark corner of the vault. I didn't hesitate. I dropped my center of gravity, shortened my stride, and advanced down the first narrow aisle between the steel cabinets, keeping my boots light and completely silent against the floor. The ground was littered with thousands of scattered index cards, loose manila folders, and torn photographs that fluttered and crunched beneath my soles like brittle leaves. Every muscle in my upper body was locked tight, my thumb hovering over the weapon-mounted light switch just in case the primary tactical beam failed. Tap, scuff, stop. The sound cut out dead. I slammed to a halt, planting my back firmly against the cold steel of a filing cabinet, and held my breath to clear my ears. I listened through the heavy ringing of my own pulse, tracking the dead silence of the room. Nothing. No breathing. No shifting timber. Just the low, distant rumble of the coastal storm hammering the exterior walls far outside. I pivoted sharply on my heel, sweeping the barrel of the Glock across the next intersecting aisle, and pushed deeper into the rows. The metal cabinets here were locked tight with rusted padlocks, their label holders filled with handwritten index tags dating back to the late 1940s, names, dates, and case numbers tracking missing persons from across the county. I didn't stop to read them, I was hunting movement, not history. I reached the very back corner of the vault where the shelving units ended abruptly against a blank structural wall. Set directly into the floorboards at my feet was a heavy steel utility grate, its perimeter bolted down by 4 industrial hex head screws. Only those screws weren't in place. They had been completely unscrewed, tossed carelessly aside into the dust alongside a heavy, long-handled socket wrench that still smelled of fresh machine oil. I dropped to one knee, keeping the gun trained on the dark opening of the grate, and reached out to tap the edge of the heavy iron plate with my knuckles. It was unlatched, tilted slightly upward on its hinges, revealing a pitch-black drop leading down into another unmapped sublevel beneath the west wing. Before I could reach down to pull the plate open, a massive, violent crash echoed from the opposite side of the vault. Crash! A heavy steel filing drawer had been wrenched completely out of its housing across the room, flying through the air before slamming hard onto the floorboards with a deafening, metallic shriek that rattled the entire wall of cabinets. I didn't blink. I exploded off my knee, whipped my body around 180 degrees, and sprinted back across the open floor of the vault, tracking the noise with the blinding beam of my flashlight. For a fraction of a second, the white light caught movement in the far aisle, a pale, distorted shape darting low to the ground, slipping past the edge of a steel rack and vanishing straight into the absolute blackness of an open inner doorway leading deeper into the dark, boss. I didn't slow down for a second when that pale shape vanished into the inner doorway, boss. I closed the distance across the archive floor in 4 hard strides, shoved my shoulder against the unlatched door, and cleared the threshold with the Glock 19 locked out in front of my face. The beam of my tactical flashlight cut through a narrow, concrete-lined utility corridor that sloped downward at a sharp 15-degree angle. The air down here was dead, heavy, and thick with the distinct chemical reek of industrial cleaning solvent mixed with old iron. The walls were bare concrete, marked only by thick smears of black grease and long, jagged gouge marks that looked like someone had dragged a heavy iron bar along the masonry for 50 yards. Clack, slide, clack. The sound of movement echoed ahead of me, bouncing off the low concrete ceiling with sharp, metallic distortion. Whatever was running down this utility shaft wasn't wearing boots. The impact sounded hard, like bare bone or thick nails striking concrete with frantic, irregular cadence. I kept my center of gravity low, staying on the balls of my feet, and pushed my pace up to a controlled tactical jog. My boots slammed rhythmically against the floor, each step sending a dull shock up through my shins. I didn't holster the light, I kept it locked forward, sweeping the corners as I cleared each junction in the corridor. The hallway terminated abruptly at a heavy, industrial-grade steel sliding door, the kind used in cold storage units or fallout shelters. The door was ajar by roughly 6 inches, casting a thin, sickly yellow beam of fluorescent light out into the dark hallway. I didn't stop to check the latch or look for a control panel. I planted my left hand flat against the cold steel face of the door and shoved it hard to the right. Screech. The heavy metal rollers screamed along their rusted overhead track, sliding open with a deafening racket that echoed deep into the room beyond. I didn't wait for the noise to die. I dropped into a low crouch, swept the muzzle through the opening, and stepped straight into the second vault. This room was massive, easily 3 times the size of the upper records archive. Rows upon rows of steel medical examination tables stretched out into the yellow glare of flickering overhead neon tubes that buzzed with a relentless, high-pitched whine. Suspended from the ceiling on heavy iron chains were dozens of large, glass specimen jars, each one filled with murky, amber-colored preservative fluid and dark, indistinct shapes floating motionless in the center. I scanned the rows, my eyes tracking from left to right in a strict sector sweep. At the far end of the room, standing directly beside a central operating table littered with rusted scalpels, bone saws, and open leather instrument kits, was a figure. It wasn't the pale shape that had bolted from the archive, boss. It was wearing a heavy, water-stained wool overcoat, its shoulders broad and hunched, its back turned squarely toward me. The figure was leaning over the steel table, its long, pale fingers methodically picking up a rusted surgical clamp and dropping it back down onto the metal tray with a clear, rhythmic tink, tink, tink. I didn't shout a warning. I didn't ask who was down here in my grandfather's hidden basement. When you catch something in the middle of a slaughterhouse setup, you don't start a conversation. I stepped fully into the room, planted my feet wide for a stable firing platform, and raised the Glock until the tritium sights were dead-centered on the middle of the figure's back. "Turn around slow, hands where I can see them," I barked, my voice cutting through the electric hum of the overhead lights with absolute, razor-sharp authority. The tink, tink, sound stopped instantly. The absolute silence that followed was heavier than the storm outside, broken only by the steady, mechanical buzz of the fluorescent tubes overhead. The figure didn't turn around. Instead, its head snapped 90 degrees to the left in a violent, unnatural arc, the neck vertebrae making a dry, cracking pop that sounded like dry twigs breaking under a heavy boot. And from deep within the damp wool collar of the coat, a voice rasped out, not a stranger's voice, but a familiar, flat cadence that made the blood freeze dead in my veins, "Boss." The voice that rasped out from inside the damp wool collar didn't belong to some random vagrant or a ghost from a local legend, "Boss." It was my brother's voice, crisp, deadpan, and carrying that exact mocking inflection he used right before he walked out of my apartment 3 months ago, leaving his car keys on the counter and vanishing into thin air. "You're late, Edward," the voice said, the words dragging like wet gravel across a concrete floor. I didn't blink. I didn't drop my sights by a single millimeter. When a dead man starts talking to you in a subterranean butcher shop hidden beneath a madman's estate, you don't waste time having an emotional breakdown, you keep your finger flat on the trigger and wait for the target to make a play. The figure didn't turn around fully. Instead, it shrugged its broad shoulders, and the heavy, waterlogged wool overcoat slid off its frame, hitting the concrete floor with a wet, slapping thud. Underneath the coat wasn't a human torso. The chest was a patchwork of gray, water-swollen flesh held together by thick, black stitches that looked like industrial twine. The skin had the bleached, spongy texture of a corpse pulled out of a stagnant river after a month underwater. The thing lunged across the steel operating table before my brain could even register the movement, its long, split fingernails outstretched to rake straight across my throat. I didn't backpedal. I leaned my weight forward, stepped inside its reach, and pulled the trigger twice in rapid succession. Asterisk bang. Bang, asterisk. The twin muzzle flashes turned the dim room into a strobe of blinding orange light, the concussive blast hammering my eardrums in the enclosed space. The 9mm hollow points punched clean through the center of the thing's chest, tearing away chunks of gray flesh and gray bone. There was no blood. Instead of arterial spray, a thick, foul-smelling stream of black sludge and stagnant river water burst from the exit wounds, splattering across the stainless steel instrument tray. The rounds didn't even slow it down. The creature slammed its full weight straight into my chest, driving the wind out of my lungs in a sharp gasp and sending me crashing backward into a towering row of steel shelving units. Crash! The metal rack groaned under the impact, tipping violently to the side and dumping hundreds of heavy glass specimen jars and rusted surgical ledgers onto the concrete floor in a shattering wave of glass and paper. I hit the floor hard, the edge of a metal shelf biting deep into my shoulder blade, but I kept a death grip on the Glock. The creature straddled my waist in a fraction of a second, its cold, heavy hands clamping down around my throat with a hydraulic grip that started cutting off my air supply instantly. Its face was a blank, featureless expanse of pale, water-blistered tissue, no nose, no lips, just two milky white eyes staring down from empty sockets. I didn't panic. I brought the barrel of the Glock up between us, jammed the muzzle directly under its chin, locked my elbow, and pulled the trigger 3 times without stopping. Asterisk bang. Bang, Bang, asterisk. The point-blank shots blew the back of the creature's head apart in an explosive spray of bone fragments and black fluid. The crushing grip on my throat vanished instantly, and the dead weight slumped forward, collapsing entirely across my chest. I shoved the limp carcass off me, rolled to my side, and scrambled back to my feet, coughing hard as I dragged fresh air into my burning lungs. Boss. I didn't waste a single millisecond admiring my work after blowing the top half of that thing's head off, boss. I shoved the warm, smoking slide of the Glock 19 back into battery, spat a mouthful of bitter, metallic saliva onto the concrete floor, and scrambled backward onto the balls of my feet. The headless carcass slumped sideways, hitting the metal deck with a dull, heavy thud that sent a minor shockwave through the floorboards. But the room wasn't about to give me a moment to catch my breath. The high-pitched, relentless whine of the fluorescent tubes overhead spiked into a deafening, glass-shattering screech, and then every single bulb blew out simultaneously in a synchronized cascade of sparking white electricity. Total, pitch-black darkness slammed down over the subterranean vault like a physical curtain. I didn't panic and I didn't freeze. My thumb snapped down on the weapon-mounted tactical light switch, flooding the center of the room with a harsh, piercing beam of white illumination. But the light didn't catch empty space. The air around the central operating table had turned thick, dense, and opaque, swirling with a violent, sub-zero fog that tasted sharply of old ozone and wet lime. The heavy, water-soaked wool overcoat that the creature had discarded moments ago was no longer lying flat on the floor. It was rising. The empty sleeves lifted into the air as if being hoisted by invisible, rigid scaffolding, swelling outward until the coat filled out into the towering, broad-shouldered silhouette of a full-grown man. There was no head resting inside the collar, just an expanding void of churning gray mist that seemed to drink the light straight out of my tactical beam. Clack, sizzle, clack. The transformation didn't stop with the coat. Across the massive room, the rows of steel medical examination tables, the instrument trays, and the towering racks of specimen jars didn't just fade into shadow, they began to corrode at a terrifying, unnatural speed. The bright stainless steel blistered, turned a sickly shade of deep rust, and disintegrated into piles of red iron dust before my eyes, swept away instantly by a howling, subterranean updraft that blasted up from the floor grates. I didn't stand there watching the laws of physics unravel. I kept my weight low, locked my wrists, and began backing toward the utility corridor entrance while keeping the weapon dead-centered on the towering gray shroud. The entity didn't charge, and it didn't lunge. Instead, a sound began to vibrate directly inside my skull, not entering through my ears, but rattling my teeth and tightening the skin across my scalp. It was the heavy, mechanical rhythm of the grandfather clock from the foyer upstairs, amplified 1,000 times over until it sounded like a heavy pile driver pounding into bedrock. "You brought the wrong bloodline down into the dark, Edward," the voice echoed inside my mind, cold, flat, and carrying the exact cadence of my dead grandfather. I didn't answer with words. I squeezed the trigger twice, sending two 9mm hollow points straight into the dense center of the gray shroud. Asterisk bang. Bang, asterisk. The rounds punched clean through the floating mist without a single ounce of resistance, slamming into the concrete wall behind the entity with a shower of orange sparks. The bullets did nothing. The entity simply stepped forward, its elongated, sleeve-covered arms stretching outward like wet leather, blocking the only exit route leading back to the utility corridor. The temperature in the vault dropped below freezing in less than 3 seconds. Frost formed instantly along the metal slide of my gun, biting hard into the skin of my bare thumbs. The red iron dust swirling across the floor began to coalesce into jagged, sharp-edged patterns, swirling around my boots like a ring of miniature razor blades. I didn't waste ammunition on a target that had no physical mass to tear apart. I flicked my eyes across the room, tracking alternative escape routes through the dissolving architecture. To my left, A secondary ventilation shaft had blown wide open from the pressure differential, its heavy louvered metal door hanging by a single rusted hinge. I didn't hesitate. I dropped my shoulder, broke into a sharp, explosive sprint to the left, and hurled my entire body headfirst toward the open vent, sliding across the frost-covered concrete just as the towering gray shroud whipped its arms downward in a crushing, sweeping motion that pulverized the steel table I had been standing beside a fraction of a second earlier. Boss. I didn't have a fraction of a second to look back as I hit the mouth of the ventilation shaft. Boss. The force of my dive carried me shoulder first into the cold, riveted iron tube, the sharp metal edges tearing through the heavy fabric of my jacket and biting deep into the skin of my arm. I didn't care about the pain. My momentum kept me sliding forward through the pitch-black conduit like a round fired down a rifle barrel. Behind me, the sound of tearing metal and crushed concrete filled the air as the towering gray shroud pulverized the room I had just vacated, the shockwave of its collapse sending a violent tremor through the floor panels and rattling the entire length of the metal tube. The shaft sloped downward at a steep 45-degree angle, forcing me to tuck my chin, pull my elbows tight against my ribs, and steer with my boots to avoid slamming headfirst into the corrugated walls. The air inside the conduit was absolute poison, stale, metallic, and freezing cold, tasting heavily of galvanized zinc and decades of accumulated coal dust that coated the back of my throat with every harsh, ragged breath I pulled into my lungs. My tactical flashlight was still gripped tightly in my right hand, its beam bouncing erratically against the narrow metal walls, illuminating fluttering clouds of black soot and rusted flakes that peeled off the joints as I sped past them. Screech, bang, thud. Something heavy was matching my pace on the outside of the conduit, tracking my movement through the masonry walls with mechanical precision. The sound of heavy fists hammering against the exterior sheet metal echoed through the hollow tube right beside my head, each blow landing with enough concussive force to dent the steel inward and shower my boots with sharp iron splinters. I didn't slow down. I pumped my legs, using my heels to brake against the corrugated floor when the slope steepened too sharply, fighting to keep my balance inside the suffocating, spinning darkness. The conduit abruptly leveled off, terminating in a solid, square iron access grate choked with thick cobwebs and rusted reinforcement bars. I didn't have room to turn around or pull a pry bar. I brought both knees up to my chest, braced my boots flat against the center of the iron grate, and let loose with a double-footed kick powered by pure adrenaline and raw survival instinct. Clang! The rusted mounting bolts sheared off instantly under the impact, and the heavy metal grid blew outward into empty space. I launched myself headfirst through the opening, tumbling out of the conduit in a messy roll and crashing hard onto a damp, slippery concrete platform. I scrambled back to my feet in a low crouch, sweeping the tactical light in a wide arc to assess the drop. I wasn't in a standard room. I was standing on a narrow maintenance walkway suspended 20 feet above a massive, subterranean water cistern built directly into the bedrock beneath the foundation of the estate. The air down here was thick with a dense, choking mist that hung over the surface of the dark, stagnant water filling the basin below to within a few feet of the platform. The water was pitch black and dead still, reflecting the harsh white beam of my light like a sheet of polished obsidian. Across the expanse of the cistern, on the far stone wall, a heavy iron bulkhead door stood partially ajar, leaking a faint, sickly green luminescence from the space beyond, the only visible exit route out of this underground trap. Before I could take a single step toward the rusted maintenance ladder leading down to the water's edge, a deafening mechanical shriek echoed from the ventilation shaft I had just exited. Clang-clack, screech. The iron grate behind me wasn't just empty anymore. A massive, pale hand with elongated, blackened fingers reached out of the dark mouth of the conduit, gripping the edge of the opening with a hydraulic squeeze that deformed the sheet metal. Before I could draw a bead with the Glock, the heavy iron access hatch set into the ceiling above the cistern slammed shut from the outside with a deafening, final thud, followed by the heavy, rhythmic slide of an exterior deadbolt locking into place. I was sealed inside the water tank, boss. And as I watched the dark, mirror-like surface of the cistern below, a series of massive, bubbling ripples began to break the water directly beneath the maintenance walkway, moving with terrifying speed toward the base of the ladder, boss. The ripples on the surface of the black water didn't just expand, boss, they erupted with a violence that felt like a localized tectonic shift. The dead, stagnant stillness of the underground cistern shattered instantly as a mountain of water and rotting biomass tore upward from the deep. A colossal shape broke the glassy surface with a wet, thunderous explosion that sent a thick wall of freezing, oily spray crashing 30 feet into the air, soaking the concrete pillars and slicking the iron beams of the maintenance walkway. The air filled with an immediate, suffocating reek of dead fish, copper, and decomposing river peat that stung the back of my throat. I didn't waste a millisecond trying to identify what kind of abominable mutation had been breeding down in the dark, lightless underbelly of my grandfather's estate. I dropped my center of gravity instantly, choking up on the checkered polymer grip of the Glock 19 in a tight, aggressive two-handed combat stance, and broke into a fast, punishing sprint across the narrow, rusted steel grating of the walkway. My heavy combat boots hammered the open mesh metal with a rhythm that echoed off the damp limestone walls like a string of small-caliber gunshots, each heavy step kicking up a shower of bright orange rust flakes that vanished instantly into the thick, choking fog hanging low over the abyss. Behind me, the sound of tearing metal and thrashing water reverberated through the cavernous vault as something unimaginably large heaved its bulk up from the depths. Its massive, elongated, clawed hands locked directly onto the lower rungs of the maintenance ladder with a sickening, hydraulic screech of stressed steel that set my teeth on edge and sent vibrations shooting straight up through the soles of my shoes. The entire suspension walkway began to sway violently from side to side, the rusted iron support chains anchored deep into the wet stone walls groaning under a sudden, terrifying shift in structural weight. The platform pitched at a sickening 30-degree angle, threatening to dump me straight down into the freezing black water below. I shortened my stride, widening my stance and dropping my torso forward to keep my balance locked low as the iron mesh buckled beneath my weight. The sickly green luminescence bleeding out from the far bulkhead door was my only anchor in the pitch-black void, cutting a sharp, emerald beacon straight across the heavy white mist. I pumped my arms with absolute mechanical focus, forcing my burning, soot-choked lungs to pull in the sulfur-heavy air, and pushed through the final 30 yards of the swaying bridge until my lead boot finally slammed onto the solid, unyielding stone foundation of the far structural wall. I didn't stop to look back or check my six, there was no margin for hesitation. I threw my entire body weight forward against the heavy iron bulkhead door, driving my shoulder hard into the corroded, riveted panels with enough force to rattle my collarbone. Screech, thud. The ancient latch mechanism gave way with a violent, protesting jerk, the heavy door swinging inward on screaming hinges and plunging me headfirst into a narrow, stone-lined service tunnel bathed entirely in that unnatural, flickering green glow. I hit the damp stone floor hard, rolled smoothly over my right shoulder to protect the weapon from impact, and popped right back up into a low, stable kneeling position, instantly sweeping the tactical light and the weapon muzzle back toward the open doorway I had just cleared. Nothing crossed the threshold immediately. The heavy iron door stood wide open, framing the dark, churning expanse of the cistern and the massive, indistinct silhouette shifting menacingly on the swaying walkway just yards away. The air coming through the open door tasted like copper and ice. I didn't give the thing an open lane to follow me. I reached out with my left hand, gripped the heavy, T-shaped iron dog lever on the inside of the bulkhead door, and hauled it down with every single ounce of residual muscle and adrenaline I had left in my frame. The internal locking bars slid into their housing with a heavy, satisfying mechanical roar, locking the massive steel plates deep into their reinforced concrete frames just as a colossal, bone-shattering impact slammed directly against the exterior plates, shaking the entire tunnel foundation and raining dust down from the vaulted ceiling, boss. The heavy metallic echo of the bulkhead door slamming shut faded slowly down the narrow stone corridor, leaving behind a dense, suffocating silence that was broken only by the low, electrical hum of the green lights overhead. I stayed on one knee for a few seconds, the Glock 19 locked out in front of my face, my eyes scanning the length of the passage while my lungs fought to stabilize against the burning rush of adrenaline. The air down here didn't taste like the stagnant rot of the water cistern or the damp earth of the upper estate. It was dry, clinical, and reeked faintly of old formaldehyde, burnt ozone, and industrial cleaning agents. I slowly lowered the weapon, letting the barrel drop to a low ready position, and stood up, wincing slightly as a dull ache throbbed through my right shoulder where I had slammed against the bulkhead. I reached up with my left hand, flicked off the weapon-mounted tactical light to conserve the battery, and relied entirely on the sickly, emerald-tinted illumination bleeding from heavy, wire-caged bulkhead fixtures bolted into the concrete ceiling at uneven intervals. The tunnel wasn't crudely excavated rock like the lower utility shafts, it was reinforced with poured concrete and lined on both sides with thick, white ceramic tiles, many of them cracked, stained, or completely missing, revealing the gray mortar underneath. Industrial electrical conduits and heavy rubber pipes ran along the right-hand wall, secured by rusted iron brackets and marked with faded, stenciled warning symbols that had long since peeled away from the dampness. I started moving forward, keeping my boots light and silent against the tiled floor, holding the Glock close to my chest as I cleared each slight bend in the passage. The corridor stretched straight for roughly 50 yards before opening up into a wider junction flanked by heavy, reinforced steel doors bearing numerical stencil marks in faded yellow paint, Sector 04. The door to the left stood half open, a jagged tear in its lower corner suggesting it had been forced open from the inside with brute, non-human strength at some point in the distant past. I approached the threshold with extreme caution, keeping my back pressed flat against the cool tiled wall, and swept the muzzle of the gun through the gap before stepping fully into the room. It wasn't another storage vault or an execution basement. It was a fully equipped medical laboratory frozen in time somewhere between the late 1970s and early 1980s. Rows of stainless steel examination tables dominated the center of the room, their surfaces littered with scattered glass specimen slides, open surgical kits, and heavy leather-bound medical ledgers with their pages warped from moisture. Along the back walls stood towering banks of analog mainframe computers, their massive tape reels sitting motionless, connected by a tangled nest of dusty coaxial cables that snaked across the floor toward a row of large, glass-fronted incubation units. The green light filling the room wasn't coming from the hallway fixtures, it was pulsing rhythmically from a single, amber-tinted emergency CRT monitor sitting on a metal desk in the far corner of the lab, casting long, eerie shadows across the equipment. Tap, hum, click. The computer terminal was running. A series of green command lines scrolled endlessly down the flickering black screen, tracking atmospheric pressure drops and structural integrity reports for the entire underground complex. I walked slowly across the tiled floor, my boots crunching softly over broken glass and discarded plastic vials, and stopped directly in front of the metal desk. Resting right beside the glowing monitor was an object that made my blood run instantly cold, a modern, black polymer smartphone, its screen completely dark, lying right next to a silver key ring holding the exact set of keys my brother had left dangling in his apartment ignition 3 months ago. He hadn't drowned off the coastal cliffs, boss. He had made it all the way down here, following the exact same bloody breadcrumbs I was tracking right now. Before I could reach out to pick up the phone, the flickering green glow on the monitor suddenly blinked out, plunging the entire laboratory into absolute, pitch-black darkness, followed immediately by the heavy, metallic click of every single steel door in the sector locking simultaneously from the outside, boss. The heavy, synchronized clack-thud of half a dozen electronic deadbolts slamming home down the corridor wasn't just a security measure, boss, it was a trap snapping shut. I didn't waste a heartbeat standing frozen in the dark. My thumb snapped down on the weapon-mounted tactical light switch, flooding the center of the laboratory with a harsh, piercing beam of white illumination that cut right through the swirling dust motes. The CRT monitor on the metal desk was dead, its green command lines instantly erased, plunging the entire room into an oppressive, shadow-drenched stillness. Hiss, click, hum. A low, pneumatic hiss rose from the floor grates, followed immediately by the sharp, stinging scent of aerosolized ammonia and burnt circuit boards pumping through the overhead ventilation ducts. They weren't just locking me in, they were purging the air. I moved fast, sweeping the barrel of the Glock 19 from left to right as I sidestepped away from the desk. Before doing so, my left hand dipped down, sweeping the black polymer smartphone and the silver key ring off the metal surface and shoving them deep into my tactical jacket pocket. If my brother had dropped those keys here before the facility went dark, whatever took him was likely still close enough to taste the copper in the air. Thump, scratch, thud. The sound didn't come from the hallway doors. It came from the towering bank of glass-fronted incubation unit standing against the back wall. I pivoted sharply on my heel, sweeping the white beam across the rows of heavy glass chambers. Most of them were filled with murky, amber preservative fluid and dark, indistinct organic shapes floating in suspended animation. But the third unit from the left was different. The amber fluid inside was draining rapidly through a floor drain with a hollow gurgling sound. And the glass was fogging up from the inside, covered in heavy condensation. A hand, wide, pale, and tipped with long, black nails, pressed flat against the interior of the glass pane from within. Crack. A spiderweb of fractures splintered across the thick, reinforced safety glass as a heavy shoulder slammed against it from the inside. I didn't wait to see the glass give way completely. I raised the Glock, locked my wrists, and backed away toward the rear of the laboratory, keeping my eyes fixed on the cracking incubation unit. Before the thing inside could punch through the frame, a deafening mechanical shriek cut through the lab. Red emergency strobe lights mounted in the corners of the ceiling flickered to life, bathing the entire room in a flashing, blood-red pulse that strobed against the stainless steel tables and the tangled racks of analog mainframe computers. An automated computer voice, distorted, metallic, and utterly devoid of human cadence, echoed from hidden speakers set deep within the walls. Asterisk, biocontainment breach detected in Sector 04. Purge sequence initiated. All personnel evacuate immediately. Asterisk. Evacuate where? The steel doors were bolted shut, and the air was turning into liquid fire in my lungs. I didn't panic. Panic gets you killed in the dark. I scanned the back perimeter of the room, tracking the massive mainframe racks. Right behind the primary tape reel unit, half concealed by a heavy, grease-stained canvas tarp, was a low-profile maintenance hatch set into the concrete base of the wall. I sprinted across the room, ignoring the burning sensation in my chest, dropped flat onto my stomach, and slammed the heel of my boot straight into the center of the rusted iron hatch latch just as the glass-fronted incubation unit behind me shattered completely outward in an explosion of flying shards and falling water. Boss. The heel of my boot didn't just strike the rusted iron latch, it shattered it completely, driving the wedge-shaped deadbolt clean out of the rotted concrete mounting frame with a deafening metallic pop. I didn't wait to see what was crawling out of the shattered glass of the incubation unit behind me. I threw my weight forward, tucking my shoulders tight and diving headfirst through the narrow access hatch just as a massive, heavy impact slammed into the floorboards where I had been standing a fraction of a second earlier. Glass shards rained down into the dark opening like deadly sleet, pinging off the metal walls of the utility chase as I scrambled forward on my hands and knees, dragging the Glock 19 tightly against my chest. The conduit wasn't a clean service tunnel, it was an unmapped drainage and ventilation line choked with decades of accumulated grime, crumbling asbestos insulation, and dry soot that clung instantly to my sweat-slicked face and burned the lining of my throat with every harsh, ragged breath. The red emergency strobe lights from the laboratory pulsed intermittently through the rusted overhead grates behind me, casting frantic, blood-red shadows against the damp concrete walls and tracking my frantic crawl through the dark. scratch, scrape, thump. The thing was right behind me. The sound of long, unclipped nails dragging across the corrugated iron floor of the chase echoed through the narrow tube with terrifying proximity, moving with an unnatural, skittering speed that defied the bulk of the creature's frame. I didn't look back. I pumped my arms, driving my knees forward through the sludge and debris, ignoring the sharp rocks and rusted wire biting deep into my palms. The air grew steadily colder, shifting from the chemical reek of the laboratory into a heavy, suffocating dampness that smelled distinctly of underground river mud and ancient stone. The floor of the conduit abruptly dropped away without warning. I slid out of the mouth of the drainage pipe in a chaotic, uncontrolled tumble, dropping 8 feet straight down into empty space before slamming hard onto a bed of damp, yielding soil. The impact knocked the remaining wind out of my lungs in a sharp, painful gasp, but I kept my grip locked around the polymer handle of the weapon, rolling instantly onto my side and sweeping the tactical light in a wide, sweeping arc. The white beam cut through the thick, swirling fog, revealing an entirely different world hidden far beneath the modern foundations of the estate. I wasn't in a military bunker or a corporate laboratory anymore. I was standing inside a sprawling, cathedral-sized underground crypt carved directly out of the subterranean limestone bedrock, its vaulted ceiling supported by massive, moss-covered stone pillars that disappeared upward into the black abyss. Rows of heavy stone sarcophagi lined the perimeter walls, their heavy lids carved with weathered, effigy markers bearing family names and dates dating back to the mid-19th century, the true founding generation of the estate, long before the county records ever acknowledged a structure standing on this coastal cliff. In the absolute center of the subterranean crypt stood a massive, raised stone dais, and resting upon it was a heavy mahogany writing desk lit by a single, battery-powered brass hurricane lamp. Spread out across the surface of the desk were open leather-bound journals, loose topographic maps of the coastline, and a heavy iron key ring identical to the one I had slipped into my jacket pocket back in Sector 04. And sitting directly in front of the desk, its back turned squarely toward me in a high-backed leather armchair, was a figure draped in a familiar, blood-stained jacket. My heart hammered hard against my ribs, but my hands remained steady as I locked the tritium sights of the Glock dead-centered on the back of the chair, planting my boots firmly into the damp soil of the crypt floor. "End of the line," I said, my voice echoing off the ancient stone walls with absolute, unyielding coldness, waiting for whatever was wearing my brother's skin to finally face the dark, boss. Echo of my voice died against the limestone walls of the crypt, swallowed up by the damp silence hanging over the stone sarcophagi, boss. For 3 seconds, the figure in the leather armchair didn't move. The heavy canvas jacket draped over its shoulders absorbed the green light leaking from overhead cracks in the bedrock. The brass lamp on the desk cast dancing shadows like skeletal fingers across open journals. Then, the chair groaned. It was a dry screech of aged wood pivoting slowly on a rusted spindle. The figure turned. I didn't blink, and my grip on the checkered polymer handle of the Glock 19 didn't slacken. The tritium sights remained locked dead-centered on the chest of the man behind the desk. It was my brother. His face was pale, drawn tight over his cheekbones like parchment, and his eyes, once the same hazel as my own, were clouded over with a milky film. But there was no vacant stare. A cold smile pulled at the corner of his cracked lips as he looked up down the barrel of my gun. "You took your time getting down here, Edward," he said, his voice smooth, devoid of the rasping sludge of the things upstairs, yet carrying an unnatural resonance. "I left the front door wide open, and you still had to kick every lock off the hinges. You aren't Edward's brother, and you know it," I replied, my voice flat, cold, stripped of panic. Whatever crawled out of that coastal shelf took his clothes, his keys, and his voice. But it missed a detail. The thing tilting its head didn't drop the smile. "And what's that, little brother?" "He never wore his watch on his left wrist," I said, my finger resting lightly against the trigger guard. He hated the weight of it. "You're wearing his silver chronograph," but the hands stopped ticking the moment the storm hit. The smile vanished from the pale face. The harmonic resonance in the room shifted, turning sharp, metallic, heavy. The entity didn't bother playing psychological games. Its body convulsed violently, shoulders expanding outward with a sickening pop of tearing fabric and bone as the human shape deformed into a tower of gray muscle and tendon. The desk splintered down the center as the creature slammed its clawed hands through the wood, sending journals, maps, and the lamp flying into the dirt. Total darkness crashed down over the crypt as the lamp died. I didn't wait for my eyes to adjust. I fired 3 rounds blind into the charging mass, the blinding orange muzzle flashes tearing through the dark and lighting up the jagged stone pillars. Asterisk bang. Bang. Bang, asterisk. The concussive blast slammed back against my face, filling the air with the reek of cordite. The hollow points punched deep into the entity, tearing away chunks of gray flesh, but it didn't slow down. It closed the 10-yard gap in a single leap, its claws outstretched to pin me to the floor. I dropped my center of gravity, ducked under the swinging arc of its arm, and drove my shoulder into its midsection, using its momentum to hurl us both against the stone sarcophagus of our grandfather. Crash! The ancient stone lid cracked down the middle under the impact, showering us in dry dust and bone fragments. The creature shrieked, a high-pitched, glass-shattering sound, and whipped its razor-sharp fingers down toward my face. I jammed the muzzle of the Glock straight under its jawline, locked my elbow, and emptied the remaining magazine into its skull at point-blank range. Asterisk bang. 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 Bang, asterisk. The final round blew the back of the entity's head apart in a geyser of black sludge and bone splinters. The massive weight went limp, collapsing forward and pinning my legs beneath its carcass. I spat a mouthful of bitter dust, shoved the dead weight off my shins, and scrambled back to my feet. My chest heaved as I dragged air into my lungs, my hands shaking slightly as I dropped the empty mag, slammed a fresh one into the grip of the Glock, and racked the slide back with a metallic clack. The crypt was dead silent again, save for the steady dripping of water echoing from the vaulted ceiling above. I walked over to the shattered remains of the desk, kicked aside the burning remnants of the lamp, and reached down into the dirt. Resting half-buried among the torn pages was the heavy iron key ring my brother had left behind, alongside a single leather-bound ledger labeled with my grandfather's neat handwriting. I picked them up, shoved the keys into my pocket, and tucked the ledger under my arm. I didn't look back at the sarcophagus, and I didn't wait for the estate to wake up for round 2. I turned my back on the underground vault, found the narrow stone service stairwell leading up toward the ground floor of the mansion, and started climbing into the cold, stormy night, boss.